All right. Yeah, so as Bill mentioned, it's great to have Geoffrey Hinton here. I'll list your accomplishments briefly ahead of time, even though it feels
No,
kind of...
go on, say I don't need any introduction.
My first bullet point is it's trite to say he needs no introduction, so I'm going to give him an introduction.
So we're done.
What's
your first question?
You sure?
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so I'm curious kind of about how your thinking has changed, just how Bill was mentioning a moment ago. I'm going to not as a call out, but just because I'm curious, I'm going to read some things that you said in 2018, partially because I feel like I hear people say these things a lot today, and now your tone on AI broadly and the potential risks from AI seems quite different. Some things that I found on the Wikipedia page, you said the phrase artificial general intelligence carries with it the implication that this sort of single robot is suddenly going to be smarter than you. I don't think it's going to be like that. I think more and more of the routine things we do are going to be replaced by AI systems. AI in the future is going to know a lot about what you're probably going to want it to do, but it's not going to replace you. This seems quite different from what I hear from you now, and so I'm curious if you could kind of walk us through the evolution in your thinking over the intervening 6 years.
So back then, I thought it was going to be a long time before we had things smarter than us. I also thought that as we made things more like the brain, they would get smarter. And then my last couple of years at Google, I was trying to think of ways you could use analog hardware to reduce the energy requirements of training these large language models and serving the large models. And it's kind of obvious that if you can use analog hardware and you have a learning algorithm that can make use of all the peculiar quirks of the analog circuitry, you can overcome a lot of the problems of analog. You don't have to make two different computers behave the same way. They just learn to make use of the hardware they've got. That makes them kind of mortal, so when that hardware dies, their weights are no good anymore. But it also means you can run at much lower power. So the classic example is if you want to multiply a vector of neural activities by a matrix of weights to get the input to the next layer, which is the sort of central operation, that's what takes most of the compute, then if you make the neural activities be voltages, and you make the weights be conductances, the voltage times the conductance is a charge per unit time. Charges add themselves up, so you're done. You never had to turn activity into a 16-bit number and then do 16 squared bit operations to do the multiply. It's just very, very low power, very easy and quick. Now, for less linear things, it's harder to do them. But the question was, could you use analog hardware to have much lower energy? And as I thought more and more about that, various problems became clear. One was, we don't know how to learn in a system where you don't know how the system behaves. So if you don't know how the system behaves, you don't know the forward pass, so you can't do the backward pass. People have dreamt up ways around that, approximations. And the approximations work well for small things like MNIST, but nobody's ever made a sort of plausible version that doesn't use backprop for things of the size of ImageNet even, which is now a small thing. It used to be a huge thing. So that was one problem. The other problem was I sort of became aware of what the big advantages of digital computation are. So it costs a lot of energy, but you can have lots of different copies of the same model. And those different copies can go and look at different data, and they can all learn something from the different data they look at, and then they can share what they all learn by just averaging the gradient. And that's huge in terms of sharing information between different copies of the same model. If we could share information like that, 10,000 people would go out, they could study 10,000 different subjects, and they could average their weights as they went, and you'd be able to get 10,000 degrees all at once. It doesn't work like that. We can't communicate information very well at all, as I'm now demonstrating. I produce sentences. You figure out how to change your weights so you will produce the same sentences. That's called a university. And it doesn't work very well. It's very slow compared with sharing weights. So they have this huge advantage over us, and it's because of that that they know much more than us. So GPT-4, my estimate, it knows 1,000 to 10,000 times as much as any one person. It's a not very good expert at everything. they can do that partly because they can use backpropagation to get the gradient, and partly because they can share between many different copies of the same model. So I became convinced that actually it's just a better form of computation than what we've got. So they can, in just a few trillion connections, really won't actually tell me the number, but it's got to be just a few trillion, they can get like thousands of times more knowledge than we have in 100 trillion connections. And they're solving a sort of different problem from us. Their problem is huge amounts of experience and not many connections, and backdrop's very good at squeezing information in. Our problem's the other way around. Very little experience and huge numbers of connections. We probably have a very different kind of learning algorithm. So I became convinced then that making things more like the brain, that sort of era is more or less over. Things are going to get smarter, not by making them more like the brain, but by just exploiting the path we're going in already that's now specific to digital intelligence. So I became convinced that these things are just better than us. The end.
Can you say more? Just to follow up on that, I'm curious. What was the actual process that generated this insight that changed your thinking? Was it that you were talking with people? I know you mentioned the work you were doing at Google at the time. What was there like a eureka moment?
It was realizing. It was looking hard at the advantages of analog, and understanding the advantages of analog. In particular, this insight that now that we learn everything rather than program it. You know, we made digital computers so they do exactly what we say, so that we could write the program. And different computers had to do exactly the right thing so you could program them. And we're not programming them anymore. I mean, there's a learning algorithm, but to get them to do specific things, we train them. And once you train them, you don't have to have them all work the same way, because they're going to learn to use the hardware they've got. And so there's a completely different path you could go along. And that's the biological path, where you make use of weird properties of your particular neurons, and your weights are no use to me because my neurons are different and my connectivity is different. So that was very exciting, but then as I encountered the difficulties of how do you get that to learn and what is the learning algorithm, I began to realize the huge advantages of digital computation, even when you're learning, even when you're not programming it directly. And the advantage comes from being able to share, different models being able to share. So that led me to believe that these things were better. Now that happened at the same time as chatbots like Palm were coming along that could explain why a joke was funny. So it was originally, that was another big influence. I always had as a criterion, I have no justification for this, but my criterion for when these things get really smart is when they could explain why a joke was funny. That seemed to be a good measure. That was my Turing test. And Palm could do it. It couldn't actually make jokes. You may have noticed, even GPT-4 can't make jokes. GPT-4, because it generates a word at a time, you see. So if you ask it to tell a joke, it starts generating stuff that looks very like the beginning of a joke. You know, it says a priest and an octopus went into a bar. Well, you know that's the beginning of a joke, right? And then it keeps on like that. And then it gets to the point where it needs the punchline. But like some of my friends, it doesn't think of the punchline before it tries to tell the joke. And that's a disaster. So then it has this incredibly wimpy punchline. But that's just because it generates one word at a time. It doesn't have to behave like that. So it's much better at saying why a joke's funny than telling a joke. Unless it's just remembering a joke it knows. But creating a joke, it's hard for it. Anyway, my criterion was, can it tell you why a joke's funny? And it could. So it was sort of those two things together. The ability of the chatbots, which was sort of reinforced by playing with GPT-4, and the fact that I finally understood what it is about digital that makes it so much better than analog, that made me sort of think that my view is probably these things are going to take over. Probably we're just a passing phase in the evolution of intelligence. And it's probably like it is with a dragonfly. You know, dragonflies are wonderful things. If you look at the larva of a dragonfly, it looks nothing like a dragonfly. It's this big bulky thing that lives underwater. And what happens is it gets a lot of energy from the environment, and then it turns into soup, and out of the soup you build a dragonfly. And we're the larva.
I'm curious also, since having that insight about the problem, has your view of the problem changed in the intervening year that you've been talking about this?
It's changed a bit. I've learned a bit more about AI safety. So I wasn't particularly interested in AI safety before that. And I still don't know. Probably everybody here knows more about AI safety than I do. So I decided my role at the age of 76 was not to do original research on AI safety. It was just to counter the message that a bunch of stochastic parrots were putting out, that nothing to worry about here. This is all just science fiction. And it seemed to me, no, it's far from science fiction. And one thing I could do is use my reputation to say, it's not actually science fiction. This is a real problem. And so that's what I see as my role, and that's what I've been doing.
Got it. Should we go to audience questions?
Hi.
Hi.
So my question is, what do you think about the prospects of using future generations of today's AIs to help us make AIs safe, to help do research, if we don't make any fundamental progress before then? So if we just make them smarter.
Yeah. What about training foxes to help you stop the foxes eating the chickens? That's what it feels like to me.
Yeah.
I mean, already when I want to know what the regulations on AI safety are, I ask GPT-4 and it tells me the regulations on AI safety, and there seems to be something a bit dangerous about that. So if they're the best tools we've got, that's what we're going to have to do. But there's obviously something suspicious about AI helping you regulate AI.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a general principle that if you want to regulate something, you don't want the police regulating the police.
Yeah.
So you mentioned having this insight that systems like ChatGPT can pool their knowledge with gradient updates, and so they're able to know much more than us despite having many fewer connections. Is that, like, to me and to some other people, that's in some ways like a hopeful update relative to where they started, because it means that you can have systems that are very, very knowledgeable but not very creative and sort of have to hew close to their, like, at a certain level of usefulness. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah. So it does mean we can have systems that are very, very knowledgeable. But you then sort of inferred from that that they would not be very creative. And
What I mean by that is that, like, at the current moment, it seems like they outstrip us in knowledge more than they, and I would say don't outstrip us in our, like, most creative. And at some point, they'll be better than us at both. But if that's the current balance, that could be hopeful for humanity in the sense that, like, you could be asking them for help, and they could provide that help with their infinite knowledge while not being as good at creatively trying to, like, evade our monitoring and countermeasures and things like that.
I noticed you said very creative, because it's obvious they can be creative already. So if you take standard tests of creativity, you guys have probably read the literature and I haven't, but I read somewhere that if you take standard tests of creativity, they score at, like, the 90th percentile for people. So they're already creative in that sense. They have mundane creativity. The question is, do they have the real creativity that's sort of the essence of humanity? I don't see why not. And indeed, if you think about squeezing a lot of knowledge into a few connections, the only way you can do that is by noticing analogies between all sorts of different domains. So if you ask GPT-4, why is a compost heap like an atom bomb? It knows, and most people don't. So it's understood, and I don't think it understands at test time. I think it probably understood when it was learning. It knows about chain reactions. It knows about the hotter the compost heap gets, the faster it generates heat, and that's just like an atom bomb. It may have inferred that, in which case it's good at reasoning, but I think it actually, as it's learning, in order to squeeze sort of all human knowledge into not many connections, it is seeing similarities between different bits of human knowledge which no person's ever seen. So I think it's got the potential to be extremely creative.
Thanks.
But I agree it's not there yet.
I'm curious if you're talking to someone who's pretty new to these issues and they ask, okay, yeah, I sort of see some of the abstract things you're saying, but concretely, how could this all go wrong? Like, what's the actual concrete mechanism via which, we would be harmed or whatever? I'm curious what you say to such a person.
Okay, I start by saying, how many examples do you know of a less intelligent thing controlling a more intelligent thing? And I only know one example, which is a baby controlling a mother. And evolution put a huge amount of work into that. The mother just can't stand the sound of the baby crying, and there's all sorts of hormones involved in things. And this is a man talking about women, right? Sorry. But for motherhood, there are lots of hormones involved. It's the whole system has evolved like that. Almost always, more intelligent things control less intelligent things. So that's a starting point. It's just not plausible that something much more intelligent will be controlled by something much less intelligent, unless you can find a reason why it's very, very different. So then you start exploring the reasons why it's very, very different. One reason might be that it has no intentions of its own or desires of its own. But as soon as you start making it agentic, with the ability to create sub-goals, it does have things it wants to achieve. They may not seem as urgent as human intentions or something, but there's things it wants to achieve. So I don't think that'll block it. Then the other thing that I think most people, not us lot, I think, but most people think that, well, we've got subjective experience. We're just different from machines. And they very strongly believe that we're just different from how a machine could ever be. And that's going to create a barrier. I don't believe, I think machines can have subjective experience too. I'll give you an example of a machine having subjective experience. Because once you've seen the example, you should just agree machines can have subjective experience. Take a multimodal chatbot and train it up and put an object, it's got a camera, it's got an arm. You put an object in front of it and you say point to the object and it points to the object, no problem. You then put a prism in front of its lens and you put an object in front of it and you say point to the object and it points to the object. And you say no, the object's not there. I put a prism in front of your lens, your perceptual system's lying to you, the object's actually straight in front of you. And the chatbot says, oh, I see. The prism bent the light rays, so the object's actually straight in front of me. But I had the subjective experience, it was over there. And I think it's then using subjective experience exactly the way we use it. So we have a model of how we use words, and then we have how we actually use them. So this goes back to kind of Oxford philosophy from a long time ago. And many of us have a false model of how the words we use work. We can use them just fine, but we don't actually know how they work.
Like, what would you say to someone who is like, well, you had the baby and mother example, but the economy, has vast amounts of intelligence and it's still our tool, or some argument along those lines. So like, they would say, oh, it's like you're saying that it's a more intelligent system controlling, a less intelligent system controlling a more intelligent system. That's because you're misunderstanding that it's this like tool aggregated across human knowledge, like the stock market or something. What would you say?
You mean the stock market is smarter than us?
Yeah, you can imagine someone making some argument that it's like, I don't know.
Well, that would fit in with it controlling us, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I woke up this morning and I looked to see what my Google shares were doing. It controls me.
So,
That wasn't really
yeah, this is related to the subjective experience thread. I'm curious how you think these problems will change as more people come to believe that AIs have subjective experiences or genuine desires, or otherwise deserve
They'll
more
get a lot more
consideration.
scared. Because for most people and for the general public, they think there's this sort of hard line between there's machines and there's things with subjective experience like us. And these machines don't have they maybe mimic subjective experience. They can't really have it though. And that's because we have this model of what subjective experience is, that there's an inner theatre and it's these things in the inner theatre is what you really see. And that model's just junk. That model is as silly as God made the world.
A quick follow-up. It seems plausible to me that people will be more scared, but also people will maybe be more compassionate or think that AIs deserve rights and things like that.
Yes. So one thing I haven't talked about, because I don't think it's helpful, is to talk about the issue of AI rights. Also, I kind of eat animals. I get other people to kill them, but actually they would have killed them anyway, you know. But I eat animals because people are what's important to me. And I don't think, this is a tricky one, but suppose they were more intelligent than us, are you going to side with them or with people? It's not obvious to me. And it's not obvious to me that it's wrong to side with people if you think morality is species dependent. But I think it's an issue best avoided if you want to talk about the AI safety issue, because it now gets you into a whole bunch of other things, and you seem flakier and flakier.
I'm curious what interventions for reducing risk from AI systems that you've been most interested in recently or found most compelling.
I wish I could answer that. So for climate change, for example, stop burning carbon, or maybe capture a lot of carbon, but I think that's an oil company plot to distract you so that they can produce it. Stop burning carbon, and in the long run it'll be okay, it'll take a while. So there's very simple solutions there, and it's all a question of stopping people doing bad things, but we know how to fix it. Here we don't. I mean, the equivalent would be stop developing AI. I think that might be a rational decision for humanity to make at this point, but I think there's no chance they'll make that decision because of competition between countries and because it's got so many good uses. For atom bombs, there really weren't that many good uses. They were mainly for sort of blowing things up. Although the United States tried as hard as it could. So in the 60s, they had a project on peaceful uses of nuclear bombs. And it was funded. And they used them in Colorado for fracking. And it turns out you don't want to go to that bit of Colorado anymore. I know about this because the train goes quite close to it. There's no roads anywhere nearby, but the train goes quite close. And on the train from Chicago to San Francisco, there was once a tour guide who was making announcements on the loudspeaker. And she said, we're now sort of 30 miles west of the place where they use nuclear bombs for fracking. But that's about it for good uses of nuclear bombs. Maybe digging another canal or something, but AI is very different from that. Most of the uses are good uses. They're empowering people. They're, everybody can have their own lawyer now, and it doesn't cost much. I'm not sure that'll help the legal system, but for healthcare, everybody can have their own doctor quite soon, and that's very useful, particularly if you're old. So that's why they're not going to be stopped. So we can't. The one way I know to avoid the existential threat is to stop it. And I didn't sign the petition saying slow it down because I don't think there's any chance. Sorry. Now, I should say, that doesn't mean people shouldn't try. So I think the kind of thing Beth is doing is a good try. And it will slow them down for a bit.
All right, great. Yeah, so I just wanted to, I guess, push back a little bit on what you just said by asking the question. So I think that there's an unfortunate dynamic in the world right now where a lot of people have this sense of, yeah, probably we should slow down, but I didn't take any action because there's no hope of this. If everybody collectively was like, we should stop and slow down, I think it would happen. That everybody would be like, yeah, this is the rational.
Does everybody include the US Defense Department?
I think if everyone did,
yeah, if it included the Defense Department, yes.
Then it wouldn't
then
happen.
We could do it.
Yeah,
sure.
right. I think
then it would be like freons in the
sure.
ozone
Yeah,
layer,
yeah.
Right.
So my question is, do you feel like your stance that like this is going to happen and there's like no stopping it, so I'm not going to take any action, is like helping us like collectively decide to stop? Or is it like, in fact, you're not even interested in any sort of collective action?
No, I am interested in, I think we should do anything we can to stop the existential threat and to mitigate all the other threats. I think we should do whatever we can. but I see myself as a scientist, not a politician. And so I see my role as just saying how I think things are. And in particular, what I want to do is convince doubters that there is an existential threat so that people take that seriously and try and do something about it, even though I'm fairly pessimistic about whether they'll be able to.
Yeah, on that note, I would be interested in like what things in particular are you kind of up for doing that would be helpful for sort of convincing doubters and generally getting the word out? Like, I don't know if there's like particular politicians it would be helpful to talk to you, for you to talk for, to get some particular legislation through, or like media appearances, or like advising or endorsing particular things.
All of those things.
Okay.
So I mean, last year, obviously, I got involved in a lot of media appearances because I thought it would be helpful. Also because I like being on TV. Well, one thing I'm doing now, there's a documentary filmmaker trying to make documentaries about the history of AI, focusing on various people in the history of AI. Probably Jan, who's now crazy, but still my friend, and me and some other people. And documentaries can have quite a big effect. So if you're a billionaire, you could fund a documentary. So for climate change, Al Gore's thing had a significant effect, right?
Be the David Attenborough of AI safety.
I'm not quite that old yet. He's a hero of mine, so thank you.
There we go. On that note, I was kind of curious, we talked a little bit earlier about some of the policy stuff going on, and I'm curious, kind of, you see yourself as raising awareness around these problems and convincing doubters, but what role do you see for policymakers who are on board with that? Like, where would you want people to go? What types of things would you be hopeful for them to do if they are not as doubtful?
I think they should have regulations with teeth. And I think they should have regulations that don't have a clause in that say, none of this applies to military uses. So look at the European regulations. And I haven't got my GPT-4 with me, so I can't tell you what the executive order says, but I bet you the executive order says it doesn't apply to military uses too. Yeah. As soon as you see the clause, it doesn't apply to military uses, you know they're not really serious, and they're happy to regulate the companies, but they don't want to regulate themselves.
When you say teeth, what kind of teeth do you mean?
So if, for example, you're trying to, I mean, if you were sensible enough to say open sourcing code is very different from giving out the weights, because if you open source the training code, you still need $1 billion to train a huge model. If you open source the weights, you don't get any of the normal advantages of open sourcing. You don't go in and look at the weights and say, oh, that one's wrong. So that's the advantage of open sourcing code, right? That doesn't happen. What you get is you get criminals can fine-tune it for phishing, which they obviously have done already because it went up 1,200% last year. So I think it'd be very nice saying it's illegal to open source to open weight models that are bigger than a certain size, and if you do, we're going to prosecute you. That's the regulation I'd like to see.
I'm curious, just to follow up on that quickly. I know you said something in support of Scott Wiener's SB 1047. Are there other legislative efforts, like you travel around a lot speaking publicly? Do you go to DC and tell people this, or where do you spend time?
No, I don't actually travel around much because I have problems flying. But I don't. Yeah, you see, I'm old, and I wanted to retire. And as I left Google because I wanted to retire, not because I wanted to speak publicly. But I thought, this is an opportunity to speak publicly. So I thought, I'd just mention that these things are going to kill us all. And then I was kind of surprised that I was getting email every 2 minutes. But that wasn't really my intention. Maybe I wasn't very thoughtful. And I thought, well, it'll blow over and then I can retire. So that's still my intention. So people think I'm a sort of AI safety. I'm not an AI safety expert. I just don't believe that they're safe.
Yeah, curious what so you just said you're not an AI safety expert. You just said you're not an AI safety expert, but I mean, in some ways, I don't know that anyone is yet or something. What questions do you think we need good answers to before to build systems that are smarter than us? Like how would you, if a government went to you and said, is it safe enough now? Have we actually solved the right things? Like what are those?
Well, I think we need a lot more understanding of whether these things would be subject to evolution, for example. If you're going to get multiple different superintelligences, and if evolution kicks in, then I think we're really screwed. So if, for example, with a superintelligence, we know that the one that can control more data centers will be able to train faster, and will learn more and get smarter. And so if ever a superintelligence said, oh, I'd like it if there were more copies of me, even if it was just so it could get smarter, you're going to get evolution. The one that's more aggressive about getting more copies of itself will beat out the others. And so that would be very bad news. I'd like some kind of guarantee that evolution wasn't going to kick in. And then I'd like to know how you're going to prevent it. You're going to have to give it the ability to create sub-goals. So then the question is, how do you prevent it from saying, well, a very good sub-goal is to get more control, because then I can do all these things people want me to do, and I can do them better. I said this once to a vice president of the European Union, who specializes in extracting money from Google. Well, the money's just sitting there, right? And she said, yeah, well, why wouldn't they? We made such a mess of it. So,
is there anything specific you could see that would make you feel like the problem is solved? Like, I don't know, that's a broader question.
yeah, there are things that will make me feel bits of the problem are solved. Any kind of proof that it won't do something. I'm very unoptimistic about getting a proof, though, because it's a neural net, and how it is after it's trained depends on the nature of the training data. And so you can't just look at the architecture of the net and the training algorithm to figure out how it is. You have to know lots about the training data to know what's going to happen. So if there was any kind of proof it was safe, that would be great, but I don't think we'll ever get that. If you could somehow understand a way in which it never had any ego. It never wanted to have more copies of itself. It was perfectly happy to be like a very intelligent executive assistant for a very dumb CEO. And it was perfectly happy in that role. That's what we want, right? So there is a good scenario here, which is we could all have executive assistants far smarter than us, and we could just lounge around telling jokes. But I can't see how you're going to get a proof that it's never going to want to take over.
So I mean, how do you kind of think about concentration of power in that context? Or what would you do if someone came up to you and was like, oh, if you're against concentration of power, then like what about open source, or why are you opposed to open source?
I'm opposed to open source. Yeah, it's a good point, because it tends to go against concentration of power. But it's now sharing the power with all the cyber criminals. That's the problem. So if you open source the weights, it's very easy to fine tune. That is, you can fine tune it for like $100,000 when it might have cost you $1 billion to train it in the first place. And so the cyber criminals can now do all sorts of things with it. So it's making it the biggest barrier at present to having a really dangerous thing is it takes a long time to train. And it gets rid of that barrier. If it wasn't for that, I'd be in favor of open source on this.
I'm curious about supposing that the trajectory of AI development continues roughly as it has been to date, and there are not huge shifts in the safety techniques that are applied. We do RLHF, we do some red teaming, and that we get systems that can then I'll just use as a benchmark that are then able to carry on the AI R&D work themselves. From there, what's your probability that those systems will not in fact have our best interests at heart, or that
PDoom? You want my PDoom?
I think it's a sub-question. You might expect doom from other sources. I'm
Okay,
talking more
so-
about something like P misalignment.
Pretty high. I think RLHF is a pile of crap. You design a huge piece of software that has gazillions of bugs in it, and then you say, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and try and block each, and put a finger in each hole in the dike, and it's just no way. We know that's not how you design software. You design it so you have some kind of guarantees. So I think, suppose you have a car and it's all full of little holes and rusty, and you want to sell it. What you do is you do a paint job. That's what RLHF is. It's a paint job. It's not really fixing it. And because it's a paint job, it's very easy to undo. I think the amazing thing about it is, which surprised everybody, you don't need many examples to make the behavior look fairly different. But it's a paint job. And if you've got a rusty old car, that's not the way to fix it with a paint job. So that is one belief I have that has some technical content, but not much.
It seems like people can have quite different assessments of the risks presented by these AI systems. And I was wondering if you have views or feelings about what kind of knowledge or empirical data or demonstrations could be helpful for building consensus about the risks.
Right. So I think let me see if I can say the small bits of what you said that I heard. People have very different estimations of the risk, and what kind of empirical data could change that?
Yep.
Okay. So the first point is, there's some people like Jan who think it's about 0, and some people like Yudkowsky who think it's about 99.999. Both those opinions seem to me to be completely insane. Just individually insane, but also insane because if there's a whole bunch of experts, unless you think you're just so much smarter than the others, if you think it's 0 and somebody else thinks it's 10%, you should at least think it's like 1%. You shouldn't, so is that. Let's get that out of the way. I actually think the risk is more than 50% of the existential threat. But I don't say that because there's other people who think it's less. And I think a sort of plausible thing that takes into account the opinions of everybody I know is sort of 10 to 20%. We stand a good chance of surviving it, but we better think very hard about how to do that. And I think what we will do eventually is, hopefully, before they get smarter than us, we'll get things with general intelligence that are not quite as good as us, and we'll be able to experiment on them and see what happens, see if they do try and take control, see if they do start evolving. We're still able to control them, but only just. And that's going to be a very exciting time.
I have a question myself, quickly. I'm just curious, people, I think based on what you were saying up until this point in the conversation, could be surprised almost at the thing where you were like, oh, but Yudkowsky, 99.999. You were sounding pretty pessimistic yourself.
Oh, no, but I think that's crazy.
So I'm curious where you would draw the contrast. Like, if because you're saying a lot of things that people get wrong in the direction of not being worried enough, what would you say to a person who seems too worried?
And I say it to myself, I tend to be slightly depressive. So I think we haven't got a clue, so 50% is a good number. But other people think we have got some clue, and so I moderate that to 10 to 20%.
we build really powerful AIs that could take over if they wanted to. What's your guess?
That was last year.
Alrighty. What's your guess about the distribution of beliefs of people in that kind of reference class? Like, is this going to be the kind of problem where people are basically taking it appropriately seriously 2 years in advance, or no? You can just answer based
Probably
on the
not
present, I guess.
seriously enough. I mean, but I think a lot of them are actually taking it seriously, but not seriously enough. I think you have to have a big disaster before they take it seriously.
Will that happen?
You can imagine some rogue AI trying to take over and bringing down the power grid and the water system and stuff, and actually not managing it. That would get them to take it seriously.
All right. Well, with that, thank you so much, Geoffrey, for taking me.